It began with a knock, soft, almost hesitant. The kind that doesn't demand attention, but lingers long enough to stir curiosity. I remember that morning clearly. The faint aroma of coffee drifting through the kitchen, rain tapping gently against the window, and the quiet hum of a house that had forgotten what laughter sounded like. My name is Linda Carter, 59 years old, retired early from my job at the library. My husband, Mark, still works part-time at the community school, though most days he's home before noon, falling asleep to old Western reruns. We've been married 34 years. A life built on routine, reliability, and a silence we both learned to live with. Love hadn't disappeared. It had just faded into something quieter, less visible, like sunlight filtered through old glass. When the doorbell rang, I assumed it was another delivery. Paper towels or coffee filters I'd ordered online the night before. But when I opened the door, it wasn't the usual rushed courier I expected. He stood there. Ethan, according to the tag on his navy jacket. Rain dripping from his hair. A small brown parcel in hand. His smile was tentative yet warm, and for a brief moment, I forgot to speak. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a brightness that contrasted sharply with the grey sky behind him. "Sorry, the roads are awful today," I managed a polite laugh. "You're doing better than I would in this weather," he grinned, brushing a drop of rain from his cheek. "Guess I've had practice." It should have been nothing. Just a brief exchange between a stranger and a customer. Yet something about him lingered. The sincerity in his tone. The casual way he noticed the small details. The potted fern by the door. The faint scent of lavender from the hallway. All of it felt oddly intimate, as if he'd stepped into more than just my home. "Nice plant," he said, pointing toward the fern. "My mom used to keep one just like that. Couldn't keep it alive, though." I smiled. "It takes patience, lots of it," he chuckled, eyes warm. "Then you must be good at that." That single line, simple, innocent, echoed in my mind long after he left. For years, no one had spoken to me with such easy attentiveness. Not my children, who live scattered across the country. Not even Mark, who loved me in the way one loves something that's always there. Quietly, but without wonder. As the rain thickened outside, I stood by the window, watching Ethan jog back to his truck. Something inside me stirred. A faint, unfamiliar flutter that felt dangerously alive. I told myself it was nothing, just a kind smile on a rainy day. But deep down, I already knew it was the beginning of something I wasn't ready to name. It's strange how quickly the ordinary becomes unbearable once you've felt something different. Something alive. For years, my days had followed the same rhythm. Coffee at 7, laundry by 9. The grocery list scrolled on a scrap of paper I rarely took with me because I always bought the same things. Mark would leave for his volunteer work at the community school, returning by noon with stories about unruly kids or broken chalkboards. I'd nod in all the right places, smile when expected, and serve lunch at precisely 1 o'clock. We'd grown comfortable inside our routine, too comfortable. Our marriage wasn't built on passion anymore, but on predictability. We loved each other the way one might love an old piece of furniture. Familiar, useful, but long past sparking joy. And I had made peace with that. Or at least I thought I had. Until Ethan. He wasn't supposed to mean anything. Just a delivery boy with rain-soaked hair and kind eyes. But that fleeting conversation at the door lingered in my mind, replaying in quiet moments when I folded clothes or watered the plants. It wasn't attraction, not yet, but recognition. He had looked at me as if I existed. A few days later, he returned. A small box again. Nothing important. "You order more tea, ma'am?" he asked, smiling like it was an inside joke between us. I laughed. "You're starting to learn my habits." He handed me the parcel, then hesitated. eyes drifting toward the living room behind me. "You live alone?" The question caught me off guard. "No, my husband's at work." "Ah," he nodded, as though that answered something for him. "You must keep busy." "Busy enough," I said, though even I didn't believe it. He smiled again, a brief flicker that felt warmer than it should have. "Well, I'll see you around, Miss Carter." "Linda," I corrected without thinking. "You can call me Linda." That night, I caught myself replaying his voice in my mind. The softness of it, the way he said my name like it mattered. When Mark came home, I asked about his day. He grunted something about the rain ruining the baseball field and went back to watching television. His plate of reheated lasagna sat untouched for 20 minutes before he remembered to eat. I watched him, this man I'd shared my life with, and realized how easily we had become strangers under the same roof. And then quietly, like a whisper against the window pane, I found myself thinking of Ethan again. His laughter, his questions, his warmth. It wasn't love. It wasn't even desire. It was aliveness. And I hadn't felt that in years. But the heart is dangerous when it wakes from sleep. It doesn't ask permission. It just reaches, even when it shouldn't. The next time Ethan came by, the sun was out after 3 days of rain. I was trimming the roses when his truck stopped in front of the house. He stepped out carrying a package, waving like we'd known each other for years instead of weeks. "You're braver than most," he said, nodding toward the thorns. "Those things fight back," I smiled, brushing soil from my hands. "And they do, but they're worth it," he grinned, eyes bright. "Guess everything good takes a little pain, huh?" It was a casual remark, but it stayed with me long after he left. Everything good takes a little pain. A line that seemed to summarize my entire marriage. That afternoon, when Mark came home, he barely noticed the fresh roses in the vase or the faint perfume I'd bothered to wear. He muttered about traffic, reheated his leftovers, and fell asleep on the couch before the evening news. I sat beside him, pretending to read, though the words blurred. My mind was somewhere else. Outside, in the quiet warmth of a young man's smile. Over the next week, Ethan's visits became more frequent. Some deliveries were legitimate. Others I suspected he volunteered for. We'd talk about small things, music, books, the strangeness of people he met on his routes. But beneath those simple exchanges, something deeper began to pulse. One day, he arrived later than usual, the sky painted with the colors of dusk. "Last stop," he said, setting down a parcel. Didn't want to end my day without saying hi. It was such a harmless sentence. Yet my chest tightened. "You could have just delivered it tomorrow," he shrugged, smiling faintly. Didn't want to wait. For a moment, silence filled the space between us. Soft, electric, dangerous. I felt the air shift. His gaze held mine, longer than it should have, and I saw a reflection of my own confusion in it. I turned away, breaking the spell. "You should go before it gets dark," he nodded, his voice low. "Yeah, I should." When the door closed, I leaned against it, my pulse unsteady. I had no right to feel what I felt. Ethan was young, kind and careless, with the kind of warmth I hadn't known in years. And yet, I couldn't let it go. That night, as Mark slept beside me, snoring softly, I stared at the ceiling, torn between guilt and longing. It wasn't love. It wasn't lust. It was loneliness, raw and restless, finally finding someone who saw it. And I knew, if I didn't stop this soon, something inside me would cross a line I could never uncross. A week passed without a single delivery. The days stretched endlessly, each one quieter than the last. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see that familiar blue truck, half ashamed that I wanted to. When the doorbell finally rang, my heart stumbled. Ethan stood there, his usual confidence dimmed by something heavier. "Hey," he said softly. "Sorry I haven't been around. Got moved to a different route." I forced a smile. That's all right. I figured something like that. He handed me an envelope. A misplaced receipt, he said. But his eyes told a different story. He lingered in the doorway, the late afternoon light slanting across his face. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt fragile, as if one wrong word could shatter it completely. "You look tired," he said finally. I laughed, though it came out brittle. "I suppose I am. Maybe you should rest," he said. And then, almost whispering, "Or maybe you just need someone to listen." Something in me cracked, not because of the words, but because they were true. I hadn't been heard in years. Not really. Mark and I had become polite ghosts, moving through our shared life without touching anything real. "Ethan," I said quietly, "you should go." He didn't move. His hand brushed against mine as he passed me the envelope. It was accidental. Or maybe it wasn't. But the warmth of his skin jolted through me like an electric current. "Linda," he murmured, "I'm sorry if this is wrong. Don't," I interrupted, though my voice trembled. "Please don't." But he didn't step back, and I didn't either. For one suspended heartbeat, the world held its breath. I saw everything that shouldn't happen reflected in his eyes. The longing, the fear, the confusion. Then I stepped away. "No," I whispered. "We can't." The air between us collapsed. He nodded slowly, jaw tight, and turned toward the door. As it closed, I felt the weight of 1,000 unsaid things pressing against my chest. I stood there, shaking, not from desire, but from the realization of how easily I could have surrendered to it. Later that night, I sat beside Mark on the couch. He was watching television, unaware of the storm inside me. His hand rested near mine, and for a fleeting second, I wanted to reach for it, to bridge the distance we'd built. But I didn't. I just watched the flickering light on his face, and wondered when love had turned into something so quiet that even temptation sounded like truth. Weeks turned into months, and life, as it always does, resumed its steady rhythm. Ethan never came back to my street, and I didn't expect him to. The memory of that last encounter lingered like a faint bruise, tender to the touch, but no longer bleeding. Mark and I carried on with our routine. Breakfast at 7, his crossword puzzles spread across the table, my tea cooling beside a half-read novel. On the surface, nothing had changed, but beneath the quiet, something subtle had shifted. Inside me. One evening, I found myself standing at the window, watching the sun dip behind the trees. Mark came up beside me, coffee mug in hand. He rarely joined me at this hour. He was more of a television man than a sunset watcher. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his voice softer than usual. I smiled faintly. "Maybe I've been thinking too much," he chuckled. "About what?" I hesitated, the truth pressing against my throat. "About us mostly. About how long it's been since we really talked." He blinked, surprised. "We talk all the time." "Not like this," I said gently. "Not about how we feel. Not about what we've lost." For a moment, he said nothing. Then he set his mug down and leaned against the counter, his gaze thoughtful. "You're right," he admitted. "I guess I forgot how to listen." His honesty caught me off guard. It was simple, unpolished, but it was real. Something I hadn't heard from him in years. We stood there in silence, two people relearning how to share space, without walls between them. I didn't tell him about Ethan. It wasn't out of deceit, but out of mercy. Because what happened wasn't about another man. It was about me remembering I was still alive. That night, when Mark reached for my hand as we sat on the couch, I didn't pull away. His touch was tentative, unfamiliar yet comforting. For the first time in years, it felt like connection. Fragile, honest, unfinished. Later, as I lay in bed, I thought of Ethan one last time. Not with longing, but with gratitude. He had entered my life like a brief summer storm, stirring everything I'd left settled. He reminded me of the woman I used to be, curious, vulnerable, still capable of feeling something deep and wild. Love doesn't always arrive to stay. Sometimes, it just passes through, shaking the dust off our hearts before moving on. And in that small, quiet realization, I finally understood the affair I almost had wasn't with him. It was with the version of myself I thought was long gone.